are on our docu-series journey of catching the DC sniper. I have with me in studio Jason. Jason, can you tell us where you were and how old you were when this whole fiasco started?
So I was still a senior in high school because this was in 2002, and so if my colleagues that I now work with at WTOP, I know they were running around crazy trying to cover this story because it was the ultimate DC story. And you got to remember it came right after 9/11 and the anthrax scare too. So suddenly this was the trifecta. This was the third, thing where people around here, they were scared to go to the gas stations. I remember, they would pump their gas and run inside, or because people were getting targeted all around the area, around this area. I actually was a senior in high school up in Frederick County. At Linganore High School. But I remember we read about it in the paper every day, and they actually wound up catching the shooters just outside of Frederick in Myersville, Maryland, where my twin brother currently lives. So I've driven by that rest stop many times where they actually caught the guys.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's
Mm-hmm.
interesting. So, how far, you said it's not far, but how far is that?
Frederick, Maryland is about an hour north of DC. Yeah, you just go up 270. So I think the idea was, you're gonna have to fact check me, but from what I remember is I think the shootings were happening around here, but then they would maybe drive out, so they couldn't get caught. But somehow someone knocked on their window of the car at the rest stop, I believe, and was able to catch them.
So, what's one of the biggest things thinking back on it that sticks with you about that case that, it probably didn't go off then, like the light bulb didn't go off then, but goes off now for you about that case?
Well, once you get past the initial shock of like that it caused the community, um, the thing that always resonates with me is the almost like a father figure, mentor kind of thing that was going on. How the older gentleman was able to, I don't want to say brainwash, that's a loaded term, but was able to convince this younger guy who looked up to him, Malvo, um, to go and commit these atrocities. There's something that sticks in my craw all these years later about how someone you look up to could convince you to do that, and that's not taking culpability off of him. I think they're obviously both at fault for pulling that off, and the horror that happened. But something about that, the relationship between the two of them, is what always stuck with me. And now my job here is at TOP is as a movie critic, and I remember a movie came out a couple years ago called Blue Caprice. It wasn't ever a wide release. I think it was like a Sundance indie kind of a thing, but they really played up the relationship between them two. And I remember there were some shots that harkened back to this old 60s movie called In Cold Blood, where they had raindrops coming down the car, but they made shadows of almost like teardrops coming down the actor's face. So I'm mixing fact and fiction, with as the movie guy, but I just remember them riding around in that Blue Caprice, and the father son vibe that was going on between the two of them, even though they weren't obviously related. Something about that always gave me an uneasy feeling.
Okay. So you were in high school. What did your parents say? Like in the mornings, as you and your brother would leave out for school.
Yeah, I think it was more just letting us know that it was going on. I worked for the high school newspaper at the time too, so we heard about it, through our professors. So I feel like I heard about it more through them than my parents. It was just more of a, hey, be careful out there. I don't think it was as bad for us up there because we were a little
So,
more removed. Yeah. In fact, a lot of people did, until they ended up catching them up there. A lot of people didn't even stop and think like, "Oh my gosh, we were in danger too." I think it was more something you'd watch on the local news, like Jim Vance and Dorian Gensler, Channel 4 or whatever. At night, you'd be like, "Oh my god, I can't believe what's going on down in DC." So it was like a chilling curiosity each night, but I don't think it really. I don't think we were as scared up there. Although you did think about it. You went to the gas station and you thought about it, but just being so close to home. But I can only imagine what if you went to if I was a high schooler down in Prince George's, Montgomery County, DC, I would have been terrified, I think.
I want to bring you in more to the conversation, because in the chapters, and as you narrate, you weave in the 911 calls from some of these cases. The one that just put my heart in my throat was the call from Linda Franklin's husband, describing what that was like. Just talk a little bit about bringing that really brings it home when you hear these 911 calls in the original.
Yes, but first, Linda Franklin was an FBI employee, and right now, since I've retired, I'm now the national president of the FBI's largest public-private sector outreach program that helps with resiliency and safety in critical infrastructure. And Linda Franklin was working on that project then. We have since named our most prestigious award every year, the Linda Franklin Award, and it goes to one citizen in the country that goes over and above and beyond what's asked of them to ensure the safety and resiliency of this country. So I just thought I'd mention that.
It's called Infraguard. It's called Infraguard.
Infraguard, yes, thank you. So the question was, the 911 calls. The 911 calls, hearing the emotion in those voices and feeling, you can actually feel what they're feeling. It's palpable. And that goes along with what XG tries to do whenever we do any type of storytelling, be it in television or in an audible project. It actually sucks you into that location almost. And it's so important. It's one of the reasons why we chose to do 10% of the interviews on scene as opposed to all 100% in studio. And we did that because we want that juxtaposition, and we want the movement of the feeling that you're getting as you're listening or experiencing this whole story.
And this is a perfect segue to Tim. You went back to the Ponderosa when you were interviewed. You were actually there again. You went back there because you could hear in the audio. You could hear that you were there outside the restaurant and describing that day when you went there, and you and I think the Bloodhound was with you, right, that night, and you found the shell casing and you found the note. It's a fascinating story, and I'd never heard it before. So please repeat it.
Okay, as I mentioned earlier, with the Bloodhound on the scene, we had the scent cards or the scent pads from the tarot card found in Bowie, Maryland, and the shell casing. They were presented to Lucy. When Lucy found that there was a scent there, it's a very different behavior by a bloodhound. And a bloodhound, as I said, has an incredible sense of smell. They have 10,000 times the sensitivity in their sense of smell that we have in our vision. And so when we can see the vast number of colors, how far away you can see a person, they can smell that person at far greater distances. And human scent sloughs off the human body. It's not just skin cells and things like that. It's pheromones that are released from glands on the back of your neck and other parts of the body where you deposit scent. And you don't know when you're depositing it, but you deposit more of it under times of stress. So you can imagine if you're shooting and killing people, you've got a lot of stress. If you're a victim of a crime, you have a lot of stress. So victims and suspects generally release a lot of human scent. So there's a lot to collect. We can't see it, we can't prove it's there, but these bloodhounds, big floppy ears which flop forward, pushing the scent towards the nose, a huge wet nose, drool hanging from their jowls. The drool hangs, it doesn't fall off, it hangs there, and it actually collects scent, and it's transmitted up the drool into the smell sensors in the dog's brain.
Which is why I don't own one.
It's a disgusting thing to be around, but they're incredible creatures.
Lucy weighs like 105 pounds, and she gets her own seat in first class when she travels.
She flies first class.
I wouldn't want to sit in that seat afterwards.
Yeah, no, you want to check, make sure there were no bloodhounds in the seat before you, because that gooey stuff in the cracks of the seat might not be somebody spilled soda. So Lucy makes a beeline, and as I had said, there were hundreds of investigators on the scene. They had been sweeping the area for hours and hours, looking for any evidence, and found nothing. And they found nothing because they're mere mortals, they're human beings. Lucy gets there, gets the scent from a scene a week prior. We pull it out of a glass jar, it's a little gauze pad, put it in front of her nose, and she makes a beeline across the parking lot. And she knows what she's looking for because she can see it. She smells what is invisible to us, but it is so clear to her. this is the scent you want, Billy. I'm taking you to that scent. And she's basically bracketing, just like the dog did to find the tarot card. She starts at the weakest point of the scent, where the victim is, and goes to the strongest point of the scent, where the suspect lay. And she takes us and parks herself right next to a clear outline in leaves of where a human being had been laying in wait for a victim. That's where the sniper was. And right there is a pristine shell casing. And when I yelled out to the local cops, hey, can some evidence guys collect this evidence? We found a shell casing. Literally, there were guys on the scene accusing us of planting evidence. I mean, saying you're charlatans, because they didn't believe this bloodhound could do what it just did. And then we shine our flashlights a little further in, and the first thing I see is the note tacked to a tree. And so that evidence was collected, not because I'm a great investigator. It's because I'm a smart enough guy to know that that dog is way better than any of us at looking for evidence, and it found it.
Give us a timeline. How long after the shooting was it that
This was after midnight.
So this was several
This was
hours
4
later.
or so hours after the victim was shot. I was on the scene within about 15 minutes of the victim being shot outside the Ponderosa. He was just being taken away in an ambulance when I got there, and we waited until everybody else was done because we didn't want to have the bloodhound have to run through hundreds of investigators to try and follow the scent. So we said, are you guys all done? And they said, yep, we didn't find anything. And then we said, all right, Billy, let's get Lucy out here and do her job.
4 hours.
Yes.
4 hours later.
Yeah, and that scent, it could be days later. The dog will be able to follow that scent. At the Exxon gas station in Massaponax, we presented the same scent pad from the tarot card in Bowie, Maryland to the dog. And the dog stood at the if you can imagine, Route 1 travels north like this. Interstate 95 intersects it and goes north on an angle like this. And the Exxon gas station is on the side of Route 1. So the victim is sitting right here at the last pump closest to Route 1 when he's shot. The dog tells us at this stoplight, the shooter was sitting still for a long period of time because there was a great deal of scent there. Then the shooter traveled north about a quarter of a mile, did a U-turn, came back south, passing by the Exxon station again, and then got onto Interstate 95 going north. So all of that information is given to us in chronological order by the dog. The dog tells us this is the most important spot, this is where the most scent is, so this is where they spent the most time, and then this is where they went. And if you think after the fact, when we find out they're shooting out the trunk of the car, sitting at that light gives them a perfect shot at where Ken Bridges was, and traveling north a quarter mile gives them that same vantage point for the next 60 seconds before they turn south, drive away without anybody knowing they're part of it.
And when you listen to the chapters, you hear that from the dog handler that tells a fascinating story himself about having to come and help out with the investigation.
And if I can just add, if only that dog could read, and some people know where I'm going with this, the dog would have known to tell the people who actually can read also to open up the letter. It was actually a 5-page letter left, so more than a tarot card this time, and it gave specific instructions that a phone call would be coming in at 6 a.m. to that Ponderosa, to the payphone outside the Ponderosa restaurant. To the credit of the investigators there, we're taught the first day in the police or FBI academy, protect the evidence, gloves, tongs, whatever, don't touch anything. And these guys and gals on the scene were so dedicated, they didn't want to open the letter at all, take any chances, but guess what? It wasn't opened up till about 11 o'clock that morning at the lab, took pictures of it. It turns out we missed that phone call because phone records later showed that the call came in at 6 a.m. And agents could have had a prime example to record that call. I'm thinking as a linguist to get actual, voice characteristics, dialect features, but we missed it.
And to negotiate with them and hopefully bring down the level of threat. I was there when the phone was ringing.
20 years working the evidence response team, I always tried to anticipate that. All the prosecutors would say, God, you think like a prosecutor. So at a case you might have heard of with the Whitey Bulger case when we captured him, they were getting ready to put all the money into bags, and I was the on-scene supervisor, and I said, whoa. I want just at least glance at every date on every one of those dollar bills, and there's almost $1 million, because everyone's going to ask us, was there any money that post-dated Whitey going on the lam? Like, was he killing people while he was out on the lam? And it turns out, no, none of it was. And they were so mad at me. And then weeks and weeks after that, everyone kept coming up to me. Everyone's asking me if there's money after the fact, you know. So
Warren's
something
pretty
to think
smart.
about. No, lucky.
I'm such a true crime nerd. I actually went and took a picture of that place where Whitey was living in Santa Monica. Took my wife there. I had to take pictures. I had to see it myself. Anyway, back to the note. Tim, you actually heard the phone ringing that morning.
Yeah, I did. I was standing right beside the door to the Ponderosa Steakhouse. Phone was ringing, payphone about 4 feet behind me. I turned to go answer it, and the local cop said, "Let it ring. It's the restaurant." I said, "Yeah, but who's calling a restaurant at 6 o'clock in the morning when it's a crime scene? We should answer it." And they said, "No, boss says let it ring." So I was overruled.
So when the note
Where was Lucy when we needed her?
Exactly.
So when the note was finally opened, the behavioral science unit got a look at it. And
Yeah, actually, behavioral analysis unit, behavioral science was the first iteration of the behavioral profilers in the FBI, and they teach at the FBI Academy, but behavioral analysis was formed to actually be interactive and actually go out and work cases out in the field and also do research and consulting and training. But yes, we got the note. Obviously, it was a lot more than 19 words this time. And the first thing that struck us, and it again sort of spoke to this duality, the shootings were absolutely very well planned and executed. And that gives us the impression that the shooter is experienced, he's calm, cool, and collected. He must have had training, and actually more than that, he must have had experience pulling the trigger on live human targets. And that means maybe he was a police officer on the streets, or maybe he was in the military. But he's so calm, cool, and collected that we believed he had to be at least in his mid-40s. However, this note was found by Tim in a trick-or-treat bag with little kids on it. And you could see through the baggie that there were a bunch of little stars that you get like when you're in first grade and you hand in your homework. I mean, it was really ridiculously immature. And again, it really highlighted that duality. And I think that's when Jim spoke up the most about how in the FBI profiling room, we're sitting around that round table talking about how experienced the sniper is. And Jim says, "Well, yeah, I get it. He's an adult, but I think he's just barely an adult. In fact, he might even be a teenager." And that was a very loud moment in the room because everybody's like, "That's impossible. He couldn't do that." Remember, we were operating on the statistics that every single other sniper case in the history of the United States has been a lone operator. And Jim bucked that system.
Not to mention a white male lone operator.
That's the experience that we had, right?
Okay.
It's time to
Ladies and gentlemen, church services will begin shortly.
So, but then we engaged in this argument. I took Fitz's side and I said, either we have a very experienced 45-year-old cop or former military person who saw action, who's planning and executing these shootings, and he's decompensating when he's writing, or for the first time in U.S. history, we have a sniper team. Again, everybody blows up. And they said, that's not possible. They don't work well together. Why would a sniper have another partner? And I said, well, what if the older one is controlling the younger one? And that was a very unique concept. Nobody really bought into that. And I said, he could be controlling him by sexually victimizing him. Then he could have complete control. And turns out Malvo disclosed that about 10 years later. And so profiling the nuances of it, we can't actually put our finger exactly why we thought those things, but Fitz and I argued with the rest of the team until we were able to convince them to put that in the profile.
And just real quick here, I was working on my master's, my second master's, this one at Georgetown in linguistics, and I was enrolled in a semantics class that semester. And I even told the professor I had to miss a few classes because I'm trying to catch the DcSniper. Go do it, you'll pass, don't worry about it, catch that guy. I couldn't make that up.
So that's cheating. It's kind of a quid pro quo, isn't it?
Something for something, I think that translates. But I was, in my studies, I had realized and I was taught that African Americans speak and write somewhat different than white people. And Boston people have accents deep south. So do blacks, and there were a few features in that 5-page letter, specifically dropping a few S's on certain words that should have been plural. That I was the first one to say, I think this one of these two guys, older and younger, whoever's writing it is African American. And again, this went against the grain of every former sniper case we've ever had, going back to Charles Whitman in 1966 and beyond, or even most serial killers, quite frankly. And they said, black, wait a minute, that doesn't happen here. I said, the language is pointing in that direction. Yeah. We've got to widen our scope in terms of suspect possibilities.
And then when you go back to the tarot card, Mr. Police is actually a lyric in a lot of Jamaican reggae songs. And so these things started to come together, and sometimes it's just our experience, the fact that we've done thousands of these cases, that we latch onto a nuance and we argue about it, and the things that we're able to convince our colleagues about, that's what goes into the profile. And we were able to do that. And at the same time, in that letter, it mentioned Montgomery. Now, everybody thought it was Montgomery, Maryland, Montgomery County, Maryland, right? But there was nothing really that stood out there. So the FBI looked into Montgomery, Alabama, and they found an unsolved shooting case from a few months earlier. And at that case, they had collected a magazine that the shooter had picked up. And magazines are amazing at picking up fingerprints.
The kind you read, by the way, not the weapon.
Not the weapon magazine, correct. And they had never run the thumbprint. And we ran the thumbprint, came back to Malvo. Turns out he was basically smuggled into the country by Muhammad, and they went up to the state of Washington. So as the FBI is out there digging up the tree stump that they used for target practice in Muhammad's backyard, we were developing this profile in tandem, and we put out the profile, and they then verified that the bullets that were found in that tree trunk matched the bullets that were found in the victims. And so we were pretty certain who we were dealing with now. 2 African-American males, one in his mid-40s, one in his late teens, and they put out the APB, and within 24 hours, they were cited and arrested.
And I don't think any of you can even begin to imagine what that feels like as an investigator when you're pouring your whole life into a case and it starts clicking. And like Jim said, you can feel it click. You can feel things starting for the first time. This guy was a ghost. None of these people were connected. When the victims are connected, or there is some connectivity, you're starting to get closer and you feel it. But in this instance, that was that moment, and that is unbelievable, and it's why we do what we do.
So that's the end of the program. We thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, and enjoy the rest of your time here.
Now, I can't offer these guys up, but I imagine you guys could answer some more questions off stage, maybe.
First, can you introduce yourselves?
I'm Jim Clementi, retired FBI profiler, former New York City prosecutor and writer-producer for CBS's Criminal Minds, and DcSniper chairman of the board and partner with Audible on Call Me God, the Audible original series on the DcSniper case.
Tim Clementi, former police officer, St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department, FBI counterterrorism agent here in Washington, D.C. in the Washington field office. I worked on the DcSniper case, lived in the area, and now partners with my brother in DcSniper, former G-men working in Hollywood.
Jim Fitzgerald, FBI retired profiler, forensic linguist, author of a few books, also worked the DcSniper case, and I'm part of DcSniper also. I'm their East Coast representative.
And my name is Maureen O'Connell. I'm a retired 25-year veteran of the FBI, and I too work with DcSniper on a number of different projects, including the Audible project.
Which she narrates.
Yeah, I'm the narrator.
So, can you guys take us back to early on in the investigation, and tell us, like, how do I explain this? Really about the psychology that went behind it, and trying to narrow down who the actual suspects were.
In the profiling unit, what we do is we try to reverse engineer the crime back to the kind of person who committed the crime. This case presented first as a spree killer, someone who's basically on the run, killing at random. But instead of decompensating over time, we saw that there was a lot of consistency in the behavior. The planning and execution of these crimes were perfect. And that told us that it was somebody who was older and somebody who was experienced and trained, possibly as a police officer or military person. As time went on and more people were killed and the jurisdictions changed and so forth, we learned a lot more about the case and about the killers.
The only thing I would add to that is that in many cases such as these, the victimology is what is the most important to us at time to assess these crimes and these types of multiple crimes. They didn't really work for us in this particular case. They were random, and although there was a goal on the part of the killer ultimately to kill one specific person, that didn't help us at all. So our hands were tied somewhat in the area of victimology, but of course that's when we make it up in other ways in terms of our behavioral assessments in attempt to strategize what the killer may do next.
At what point in the investigation did you all come up with the assessment that it really was just one person that he was ultimately after?
That actually came later, although already very early on, I rendered an unofficial opinion to some people that, in fact, it may be a very specific target, even on that first day in Montgomery County when the 6 shootings occur. So yeah, as it turns out, on the very first day when I heard about these, I told some people I'm with it may be somebody in that mix who was the actual target, the other 5 being collateral. That wasn't exactly correct, but it turns out the ultimate goal of the DcSnipers, plural, was in fact to take out the ex-wife of John Muhammad, and she was the ultimate victim in that case and the ultimate reason, among others, besides that whole murder spree.
And if I could add to that, Mildred Muhammad is somebody you should look at, talk to, look at what she's doing. She's an advocate for victims of domestic violence, very articulate woman with a capturing of the facts of the entire situation, and knowing that she became a victim's advocate because she was possibly the true intended target of all these deaths. It's something that I can't imagine that weighing on you as an individual, but she's an incredible woman, and we had the pleasure of meeting with her just this week in New York City, and to think that she was victimized by John Muhammad during the time of their marriage, after their marriage, when he kidnapped their children, fled the country with their children without her knowledge. She was without her kids for almost a year and a half. And so she was terribly victimized by John Muhammad before he went on the killing spree.
As a woman on the case, like what were the dynamics of having to go through the process and, problem solve, like what was going on?
I didn't actually work on this particular investigation. I narrated the project. However, I spent 20 years on the FBI's evidence response team, where I responded to a multitude of crime scenes, both domestic and abroad, everything from bombings to homicides to plane crashes. And what was it like? It was like teamwork, and that's just how I approached it. I try to give it my all. I try to work well. I try to be a good team member, and I try to look out for the other people that I'm working with. And I think if you do those things, when you find yourself in a vulnerable situation where you feel heavily impacted by what's happening, your teammates will be there for you because you've been there for them.